Before we continue, tell me where you're listening from, and if you still believe a quiet man can change his own story without firing a single shot, stay with me. They threw her out of Miller's saloon just before sundown, not because she'd stolen anything, not because she'd raised her voice, but because the room went silent when she walked in and no one wanted to break that silence. 10 minutes later, she stood at the edge of Elias Turner's porch, hat in her hands, boots dusted white from the long road, the last light of a Texas evening burning behind her like a warning. I don't talk much, mister, but I can cook. Elias hadn't heard a woman's voice on that porch in 12 years. Not since the day they lowered Margaret into 6 feet of dry earth, and the wind carried the preacher's words clean off the prairie. He lived 40 miles from the nearest town, on a ranch that barely paid for its own fence wire, in a house that held more echoes than furniture. Supper was usually cold beans and coffee gone bitter on the stove. He looked at her the way a man looks at a coming storm, measuring distance, wondering if he should shut the door before it reaches him. She was young, maybe 19, Apache by her features, steady by her eyes. No fear in them, just exhaustion. The town had made its opinion clear. He'd heard the laughter when she stepped off the boardwalk. He'd heard the word they used for her. Elias had lost a son to a border dispute years ago, a foolish fight over grazing land that left both sides grieving and no one wiser. Since then, he kept his gates closed and his thoughts closer. "Can you make cornbread?" he asked finally, voice rough from disuse. She nodded once. Didn't smile. Didn't plead. Just nodded. The wind lifted the edge of her shawl, and he saw it then, hanging from her belt. A kitchen knife, worn smooth at the handle, the steel kept clean despite the miles. He almost missed it. Almost. Until the porch light caught the engraving along the wood. Margaret Turner. His breath stalled like a horse reined too hard. That knife had been buried in a drawer the day his wife died. He stepped closer without meaning to. "Where'd you get that?" Her fingers brushed. The handle gently, not possessive, not afraid. "A woman gave it to my mother," she said. "Said if we ever needed work, to find this ranch." The prairie went quiet. Even the cattle seemed to hold still. Elias hadn't known Margaret had given anything away. Hadn't known she'd kept secrets from a town that watched everything. He looked past the girl, out toward the long fence line stretching half a mile into fading gold, and for the first time in years the ranch didn't feel empty. It felt like it was waiting. He stepped aside. "Kitchen's through there," he said, careful, controlled. "Don't waste flour." She tipped her head once in thanks and walked in without another word. And as the screen door closed, Elias Turner realized the past hadn't come back to haunt him. It had come back to remind him of who his wife had been, and who he still might choose to be. The first thing Elias noticed was the smell. Not smoke. Not burnt coffee. Real food. Cornbread rising in a cast-iron skillet, butter melting slow along the edges, onions softening in a pan like they had nowhere else to be. He stood just outside the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, telling himself he was only making sure she did not waste supplies. The girl moved without noise, without wasted motion. She measured flour with her hand, not a cup. She tasted the stew once, then added a pinch of salt like she had known the pot her whole life. Elias had not seen that kitchen alive in years. The curtains had stayed drawn. The table had held only one plate. Margaret used to hum when she cooked. A low tune, barely there. This girl did not hum. But the silence felt different. Steady. Intentional. "You learned that from your mother?" he asked finally. She shook her head once. "Your wife." The answer landed quiet, but heavy. Elias stepped inside fully now. "You knew Margaret?" "No, sir. My mother did." She slid the cornbread onto a tin plate and turned the knife in her hand before setting it down carefully on the counter. "Margaret Turner." The letters were worn but clear. "Your wife brought food to our camp one winter," the girl continued. "Said hunger did not care about color." Elias looked down at the table. Margaret had told him she was visiting a widow that winter. He had not asked questions. Men out here did not ask too many questions if supper was warm when they came home. "My mother was sick," the girl said. "Your wife stayed 3 days. She left this knife. Said if things ever turned bad, find the ranch with the cedar fence that runs straight for half a mile." Elias felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with age. He had built that fence the summer before Margaret passed. He remembered her standing there, hands on her hips, saying it looked like a promise stretching into the horizon. The girl placed a bowl in front of him. "Eat before it gets cold." It was not a command, not a plea, just a fact. Elias sat. The stew tasted like something he had not allowed himself to remember. Not exactly Margaret's recipe, but close enough to stir dust off memories he had packed away. He chewed slow. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass in long, patient waves. "Town will not like this," he said after a moment. "Town does not feed me," she replied softly. No challenge in her voice. No defiance. Just truth. Elias looked at her then, really looked. She was not asking for shelter out of pity. She was offering work. Offering steadiness. Offering something this ranch had not felt in a long time. He finished the bowl. Wiped it clean with the last piece of cornbread. Then he stood and walked to the cupboard. He pulled down a second plate and set it across from his. The wood scraped slightly against the table. The sound echoed through the room like a decision. "Sun comes up at 5, he said. "Cattle need checking before heat sets in." She nodded once. Sat down. And for the first time in 12 years, Elias Turner did not eat alone. The next morning came thin and pale, the kind of Texas dawn that stretches slow across open land and makes every fence post cast a long shadow. Elias was already awake when he heard movement in the kitchen, not clatter, not hesitation, just the quiet rhythm of someone who understood mornings on a ranch. He stepped outside with his coffee and saw her near the corral, sleeves rolled to her wrists, studying the cattle like they were a language she was learning by sight. The air carried the scent of dust and cedar. 50 head grazed beyond the fence line, the pasture running nearly half a mile before it met the dry creek bed. She did not wait to be told what to do. She opened the feed shed, measured grain carefully, and closed every latch behind her. No wasted motion. No questions. Elias watched from a distance, telling himself he was inspecting her work, but he knew he was measuring something else. Trust did not return all at once. It came like sunrise, inch by inch. By mid-morning the heat had already begun to rise off the earth. He handed her a water canteen. Their fingers almost brushed, but did not. "Town day is Thursday," he said, adjusting the brim of his hat. "Supplies run low." She nodded once. "I can ride," she said. "I did not say you were going," he replied. The words sounded harder than he meant them to. She did not argue, just tightened the strap on the saddle she had already prepared. He noticed, then she had checked the girth twice, adjusted the stirrups to his height without being asked. Margaret used to do that. The memory came without warning. "Why did you not go to your own people?" he asked as they rode the quarter-mile down to the south fence line. The question hung between them, heavier than the sun. "Some of them left," she answered. "Some stayed. But work is work. Hunger is hunger. Simple. Honest. No bitterness." They rode in silence for another stretch, the hooves steady against packed earth. From the ridge above, the town could be seen in the far distance, just a scatter of buildings no bigger than matchsticks from where they stood. Elias knew what waited there. Eyes that counted who rode in and who rode out. Whispers that traveled faster than any horse. By noon a neighbor's wagon rolled along the road that bordered the ranch, wheels groaning against dry ruts. The driver slowed when he saw her near the barn. Did not wave. Did not tip his hat. Just stared long enough for the message to settle in the dust. Elias felt the old instinct rise, the one that told him to avoid trouble by avoiding attention. Instead, he walked across the yard and handed her the ledger book. "Keep tally of the feed," he said loud enough to carry. Not a defense, not an apology, a statement. She took the book carefully, like it weighed more than paper. Inside the house, the second plate still rested on the table from the night before. Elias paused in the doorway and looked at it. For years that table had held one fork, one cup, one chair pulled close to the edge. Now there were 2 impressions in the wood where elbows had leaned. Outside, the wind shifted. And for the first time since Margaret's passing, Elias Turner realized that the quiet on his ranch was no longer empty. It was shared. Thursday came with a sky the color of worn tin and a wind that carried dust in long, patient lines across the prairie. Elias hitched the wagon just after sunrise, the wooden wheels creaking in a rhythm older than memory. Lila stood by the gate, ledger tucked under her arm, shawl pinned tight against the breeze. He had not told her she was coming, but she had saddled the second horse anyway. He studied her for a moment, measuring the distance between caution and trust. "Town keeps its eyes open," he said at last. "Let them," she answered quietly. The ride took nearly an hour, 5 miles of open land, where fences cut straight through grass the color of faded gold. Neither of them spoke much. The sound of hooves and harness chains filled the space between them. When the first buildings came into view, Elias felt the familiar tightening in his chest. Towns did not forget easily. They remembered bloodlines longer than they remembered kindness. As they rolled down Main Street, conversation slowed. A pair of men near the general store stopped mid-sentence. A woman gathering flour sacks turned her head just enough to see. Lila kept her eyes forward. Not proud, not ashamed, just steady. Elias climbed down from the wagon and tied the reins to the post outside the supply store. He could feel the weight of glances like sun on his back. Inside, the air smelled of coffee beans and kerosene. The shopkeeper, Mr. Dobbins, looked from Elias to Lila and back again. "You hiring help now?" he asked, tone careful but not friendly. "She works my ranch," Elias replied, voice level. No explanation followed. Dobbins nodded once, slow, and began measuring feed into burlap sacks. Lila moved through the store quietly, selecting flour, salt, and a spool of thread. She counted coins from a small cloth pouch, exact to the penny. When she placed the money on the counter, her hands did not shake. Outside, a group of townsfolk gathered near the boardwalk. No one stepped forward. No one spoke aloud. But the silence held questions sharp enough to cut. Elias loaded the wagon himself, refusing the boy who usually helped for a nickel. As he lifted the final sack, he noticed Lila standing near the water trough, her gaze fixed on something across the street. A faded sign hung above the old doctor's office, paint peeling at the edges. He followed her line of sight and understood. That was where Margaret had once spent an entire winter bringing blankets and broth to families who would not walk through the front door. "She told us kindness travels farther than anger," Lila said softly, almost to herself. Elias adjusted his hat, eyes on the horizon beyond the rooftops. "Kindness costs," he answered. "So does loneliness," she replied. The wind shifted then, carrying the scent of rain though no clouds were yet visible. Elias climbed onto the wagon seat and extended his hand to help her up. For a brief second, the whole street seemed to hold its breath. She took his hand, firm and unhesitating. He did not pull away. As the wagon rolled forward, wheels crunching over gravel, Elias did not look back at the watching faces. He kept his eyes on the long road home, knowing that by choosing who sat beside him, he had chosen something far greater than supplies. And this time, he did not intend to close the gate behind it. The road home felt longer than the road into town. The sky had darkened by late afternoon, clouds gathering low and wide across the horizon like a silent decision forming. Elias drove the wagon steady, the reins loose in his hands, while Lila kept her eyes on the cattle line in the distance as if measuring how much had changed in a single day. When the ranch came into view, the cedar fence stretching straight as a promise across the prairie, Elias felt a shift in the air that had nothing to do with weather. Something waited. The gate stood slightly open. He was certain he had latched it before leaving. He said nothing at first, just climbed down slowly, boots pressing into dust that still held the faint imprint of unfamiliar tracks. Not many, just enough. Lila saw them too. She did not step back. She did not step forward. She simply stood beside him, reading the ground the way other people read newspapers. "They came to look," she said quietly. Elias nodded once. The barn door was closed, but not fully. Inside, everything appeared untouched. Saddles hung in place. Feed sacks remained stacked. Nothing taken. Nothing broken. Just presence. A message without words. Elias stepped back into the yard and looked toward the house. For 12 years that porch had faced nothing but wind. Now it faced opinion. He exhaled slow. "They want me to choose," he said. Lila turned her gaze toward the setting sun, the light catching the edge of her shawl. "You already did," she replied. The first drops of rain began to fall then, soft at first, tapping against the tin roof like knuckles asking permission. Elias secured the wagon while Lila moved to gather the laundry from the line without being told. Thunder rolled far off, not threatening, just present. By the time they stepped inside, the storm had settled and steady and sure, washing the dust from the air. Elias removed his hat and set it on the hook by the door. The house felt different tonight. Not tense, not afraid, just aware. Lila moved to the stove and began preparing supper without announcement. The rhythm returned. Chop, stir, simmer. Outside, rain ran in narrow streams along the fence posts, darkening the cedar. Elias sat at the table, listening to the weather move across his land in long, patient waves. He thought about the open gate, about the town, about Margaret standing in that same kitchen years ago, speaking of kindness like it was a crop worth planting even in poor soil. He rose from his chair and walked to the door. The storm had washed the tracks nearly clean. By morning they would be gone. He closed the gate himself this time, fastening it tight, not in fear, but in resolve. When he returned inside, 2 plates were already set on the table. Steam rose between them, simple and steady. Elias pulled out his chair, then reached across and adjusted the second one slightly closer to the table. The wind pressed against the windows, but it did not enter. And as thunder faded into the distance, Elias Turner understood that storms, like opinions, could pass. What remained was what a man chose to protect within his own fence line. The rain had cleared by morning, leaving the prairie rinsed and quiet, the air sharp with the scent of wet cedar and clean earth. Sunlight stretched low across the pasture, turning every drop along the fence wire into a thin line of gold. Elias was already outside, checking the southern posts where the ground dipped toward the creek bed. The storm had not done much damage, just softened the soil, just reminded the land who was in charge. Lila stepped out of the house, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, her steps steady on the damp boards of the porch. She did not speak when she handed him one. She did not need to. The cattle were calm, 50 heads grazing slow, steam rising faintly from their backs in the cool morning air. For a moment, it felt like the ranch had accepted her the way the sky accepts weather. Without complaint, without applause, Elias took a long drink and studied the horizon. "They will come again," he said, not looking at her. "To look," she answered. Not fearful, not surprised, just certain. He nodded once. In town, opinions moved in circles, returning to the same doorstep until someone answered. Here, things were simpler. A fence either stood or it fell. A man either meant his word or he did not. Lila moved toward the chicken coop and repaired a loose hinge without being told. Elias watched her tighten the screws with patient hands, the same hands that had held Margaret's knife with care. He had spent years believing the past was something to guard against, something that carried only regret. Now it seemed the past had planted something in his own yard and waited 12 years to see if he would water it. Around midday, a rider appeared at the far end of the property line, a small figure against the wide sky. Not close enough to threaten, not distant enough to ignore. Elias did not reach for a rifle. He simply stood straighter. The rider paused near the cedar fence, studying the house, the barn, the woman working beside the well. Then, after a long moment, the rider turned and continued down the road without a word. Lila exhaled softly. "Curiosity," she said. Elias nodded. "It fades," but he knew that was only partly true. Curiosity sometimes faded. Sometimes it hardened. He walked to the porch and lifted the old wooden crate that had once held firewood. From inside, he pulled out a small plank Margaret had painted years ago. The letters were faint but readable. Turner Ranch. Established with trust. He had never nailed it up, had never felt certain the words still belonged there. He carried the sign to the front post and secured it just below the lantern hook. The hammer strikes were measured. Not loud, just firm enough to last. Lila watched without interrupting. When he stepped back, the sign caught the afternoon light. Established with trust. The words felt different now. Not like memory. Like decision. Elias set the hammer down and turned toward her. "Supper will be early," he said. "Long day tomorrow." She nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and walked toward the house. The prairie stretched wide and quiet around them. Fence lines straight as ever, sky open and patient above. And for the first time in many years, Elias Turner understood that protecting something did not always mean keeping it out. Sometimes it meant letting it stand beside you, in plain sight, under the same sun. The next few days settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, and that was what made it dangerous. Ordinary had a way of making a man forget that eyes still watched from beyond his fence line. The mornings came cool and pale, the sun climbing slow over the eastern ridge, casting long shadows from the cedar posts that ran half a mile straight across the Turner land. Lila rose before Elias now, coffee already poured by the time he stepped into the kitchen. She moved through the house like someone who understood that belonging was earned in small, steady gestures. No wasted flour. No wasted words. The sign he had nailed to the porch post caught the light each afternoon, the paint chipped but stubborn. Established with trust. It was not long before that word was tested. On Saturday, a wagon rolled up the main road and did not pass by. It stopped just outside the gate. Elias saw it from the barn and wiped his hands on a cloth before walking out. Two men sat on the bench seat, hats low, boots clean enough to show they did not work fields. They did not dismount. They simply looked past him toward the house, toward the porch, toward the movement behind the window where Lila stood still as glass. "We heard you took on help," one of them called, voice polite but edged. Elias rested his forearms on the top rail of the fence. "I did." The wind moved between them, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant rain that would not come. "Town is concerned," the second man added. "Concern is not a crop I grow," Elias replied evenly. Silence stretched. No threats. No raised voices. Just the weight of expectation hanging in open air. One of the men glanced at the sign on the porch, reading the faded words. His mouth tightened, but he said nothing more. After a moment that felt longer than it was, the wagon rolled on, wheels turning slow, dust rising behind them like a question left unanswered. Elias remained at the fence until they were no more than specks against the horizon. When he turned back toward the house, Lila had stepped onto the porch. She did not ask what was said. She had heard enough in the tone. "They will measure you now," she said quietly. Elias nodded once. "Let them bring their ruler." He walked past her into the house and sat at the table, staring at the grain of the wood where two plates had left faint circles over the past week. Margaret had believed that goodness did not need defending. It needed living. Lila moved to the stove and stirred the pot already warming for supper. The scent of onions and fresh bread filled the room, steady as breath. Outside, the cattle grazed, unaware of town talk or passing wagons. The fence stood straight. The gate remained closed. And as evening settled over the prairie, Elias Turner understood that the true test of trust was not whether others approved of it, but whether he could stand by it when they did not. Monday arrived with a dry wind that carried no scent of rain, only dust and distance. The prairie lay open and honest beneath a wide Texas sky, and yet something in the air felt measured, as if the land itself were waiting to see what Elias Turner would do next. The cattle moved slow along the northern fence, 50 head drifting in. A loose line toward the creek bed. Lila walked beside them, keeping a steady pace, her shawl tied back so it would not catch the breeze. She did not drive them. She guided them. Elias watched from the porch, hat low over his brow, the wooden sign beside him catching the morning light. Established with trust. The words had begun to draw more attention than he expected. Around noon, a small cloud of dust rose on the far road again. Not a wagon this time. 3 riders. They did not approach the gate. They stopped a good 100 yards away, enough to show caution, close enough to show intention. Elias stepped down from the porch without hurry. He did not call for Lila. He did not reach for anything but his hat brim, adjusting it against the glare. The riders remained mounted. One lifted a hand in greeting that was more formality than warmth. "We hear you plan to sell beef in town next month," the man called out. Elias nodded once. "That is how ranches stay open." The second rider shifted in his saddle. "Some folks might not buy if they think you are taking sides." The wind moved between them, carrying the faint smell of sun-baked leather and dry grass. Elias rested his hand on the top rail of the fence. "I am taking care of my land," he said. "That is the only side I know." The riders exchanged glances. No anger. No raised voices. Just a quiet attempt to draw a line where one had not existed before. Lila had paused her work, but did not come closer. She stood near the cattle, calm, her presence visible yet unhidden. The third rider finally spoke, softer than the others. "Town does not forget." Elias looked past them to the open horizon, where the road stretched thin and pale for miles. "Neither does a man who made a promise," he answered. Silence followed, long enough for the weight of those words to settle. The riders did not press further. After a moment, they turned their horses and rode back toward town, dust rising behind them in slow spirals that soon dissolved into air. Elias remained at the fence until the road lay empty again. When he turned, he saw Lila guiding the last of the cattle through the gate with patient hands. No fear, no pride, just work. He walked toward her, boots pressing firm into earth that had held his footsteps for decades. They will test supply next, he said quietly. Then let our supply be strong, she replied. The simplicity of it struck him. Strength did not always come from numbers. Sometimes it came from standing still when others expected you to step aside. As evening lowered across the ranch, the cattle settled, the fence stood straight, and the porch lantern flickered on against the coming dusk. Elias paused beneath the sign once more, reading the faded letters in the soft light. Trust was not a word you nailed up once. It was something you rebuilt each time it was questioned. And as the prairie wind moved steady through cedar and grass, Elias Turner knew the line had been drawn not by town talk, but by his own quiet resolve. The next morning broke warmer than the rest, the kind of heat that settles in early and promises a long day. Elias was mending a stretch of fence along the eastern boundary when he noticed something that made him pause. The top wire had been loosened. Not broken, not cut, just loosened enough that a steer could test it and wander. He crouched, running his fingers along the metal. It had not been wind. Wind did not untwist wire with patience. Lila approached without sound, carrying a small wooden box of nails and tools. She saw the wire and understood without asking. They want the cattle to drift, she said quietly. Elias nodded. 50 head of beef wandering toward open range would mean loss. Not ruin, but loss enough to feel. He tightened the wire with steady hands, each turn deliberate. Then we check every line, he replied. They spent the next 2 hours walking the full half-mile of cedar posts under a sun that climbed higher with each step. Sweat gathered at his collar. Dust clung to her boots. Every 20 yards they stopped, inspected, secured. It was slow work. Honest work. The kind that answered quiet interference with louder patience. By midday they had finished the eastern fence and moved south toward the dry creek bed. The earth there still held dampness from last week's rain, soft enough to show tracks. Elias saw them first. 2 sets of prints near the post, boots not his, not Lila's. They had stood there a while. Watching, measuring. Lila knelt to examine them, her fingers hovering above the impressions without touching. They expected anger, she said. They expected fear. Elias looked across his pasture where the cattle grazed unaware of human lines drawn in dust. They will get neither, he answered. When they returned to the barn, Elias pulled out a coil of heavier gauge wire he had been saving for winter repairs. Without a word, Lila helped him replace the weaker stretches with stronger lines. Not temporary fixes, permanent ones. The sun beat down hard by late afternoon, the air shimmering above the ground in waves. Elias wiped his brow and stepped back to examine the fence. It stood straight, firm, unyielding. If they loosen it again, he said, more to himself than to her, they will only waste their own time. Lila looked toward the road that led to town, her eyes steady beneath the brim of her hat. Some men test fences to see if they can cross, she said. Others test them to see if they can make you leave. Elias rested his hands on the top rail, feeling the solid resistance beneath his palms. This land was paid for in full, he said calmly. No one will make me leave. The wind picked up as evening approached, moving through the grass in long ripples. The cattle remained within their boundary, heads down, grazing without concern. Elias and Lila walked back toward the house together, boots leaving parallel tracks in the dirt. Behind them, the reinforced fence caught the fading light, a thin line of silver against the prairie. It was not just wire anymore. It was decision made visible. And as the sun dipped low, Elias Turner understood that the true test was not whether someone tried to loosen what he had built, but whether he chose to strengthen it instead of surrendering it. The following week arrived without warning, not in the sky, but in the ledger. Elias sat at the kitchen table early Tuesday morning, sunlight stretching across the wood in pale stripes, and ran his finger down the column of expected deliveries. The grain shipment due from town had not arrived. It was 2 days late. Not impossible, not unheard of, but unlikely. Lila stood at the stove, stirring oats in a slow circle, watching him without seeming to watch. They test supply next, he had said before. Now the test had begun. 50 head of cattle needed steady feed to keep weight. Missing grain meant stretching what remained. Elias closed the ledger gently. No curse, no sigh, just a measured breath. We ration, he said. Lila nodded once. We plant. He looked up. Plant. There is unused ground beyond the western fence, she continued. Soil is dry but not dead. We can turn it. Elias had not planted anything but grass seed in years. Ranchers bought what they needed. They did not gamble on crops in this climate. Yet the idea settled into him with quiet logic. Dependence was a rope others could pull. Self-reliance was a fence no one could loosen. By mid-morning they were walking the quarter-mile to the western stretch, boots pressing into hard earth that had not been worked in over a decade. The land looked stubborn, but stubborn land still broke under patient hands. Elias fetched the old plow from the shed, its iron edge dulled by time, but not useless. Lila tied back her shawl and took hold of the handle beside him. They worked in silence, turning row after row beneath a sun that showed no mercy. Sweat darkened his shirt. Dust streaked her sleeves. Each pass carved a thin line of possibility into ground that had been written off. Around noon, a wagon rolled past on the distant road. It did not stop. It did not slow. But Elias knew the riders, saw them working soil that had long been idle. Let them see, he thought. Let them understand that withholding grain would not empty this table. By late afternoon, the first full row lay ready for seed. Elias leaned on the plow, breathing heavy but steady. "What will we grow?" he asked. Lila crouched and pressed her fingers into the loosened dirt. "Beans," she said. "They ask little. They endure heat. They return more than they take." Elias considered that. Beans were not glamorous, not profitable, but they sustained, just like trust, just like quiet decisions made under pressure. As the sun dipped low, they stood side by side at the edge of the freshly turned earth. The ranch looked different from this angle, not just cattle and fence lines. Now there were rows. Intention. "They expect us to bend," Elias said. Lila brushed soil from her hands and faced the horizon. "Then we grow instead." The wind moved across the prairie in long, steady waves, carrying dust from town, but not its control. And as Elias Turner walked back toward the house with the plow resting against his shoulder, he understood something simple and unshakable. A man who can grow his own food does not fear an empty wagon. A man who stands by his word does not fear an empty street. And on land that wide, beneath a sky that honest, the strongest answer was not anger. It was endurance. The beans went into the ground on a Thursday evening, just before sunset, when the heat loosened its grip and the soil held a trace of cool beneath the surface. Elias dropped each seed with deliberate care, 2 inches deep, 6 inches apart, row after row carved into land that had not known crops in years. Lila followed behind, pressing earth over each small promise with the flat of her palm. The work was quiet, almost reverent. No grand declaration. No witness but the prairie sky turning amber above them. By the time the last row was covered, the first stars had begun to show. Elias stood at the edge of the field and looked back at what they had planted. It did not look like much, just lines and dirt. But lines, he had learned, mattered. Lines held cattle in. Lines held resolve steady. Lines showed where a man stood. The next morning, before the sun fully rose, a wagon finally appeared on the distant road. It was the grain shipment, late and slow, pulled by a team that seemed in no hurry. Elias watched from the porch as it approached, dust lifting behind it in thin spirals. The driver climbed down without meeting his eyes. "Supply was delayed," he muttered, voice flat. Elias nodded once. Understood. No accusation. No gratitude either. Just acknowledgement. The sacks were lighter than expected. Not short enough to argue. Not full enough to ignore. A careful message wrapped in burlap. Lila stood near the barn door, observing the exchange with steady calm. When the wagon rolled away, Elias carried the sacks inside and stacked them neatly. "They expect relief," he said quietly. "They expect me to be grateful." Lila stepped toward the open barn doors and looked past the fence toward the western rows. "Gratitude is not required for what is already ours," she replied. The words settled into him like weight and balance combined. That afternoon, under a sun that showed no sign of softening, Elias walked the fence again. Not because he suspected tampering, because routine had become resolve. The cattle remained within their boundary. The reinforced wire held firm. At the far corner near the creek bed, he paused and looked back toward the house. The sign on the porch caught the light. Established with trust. It had begun to fade slightly from weather, but the letters were still clear. Back at the western field, Lila knelt and pressed her hand into the soil as if listening. "They will rise," she said softly, "if the roots take." Elias rested his hands on his hips and stared across the land. He had nearly allowed fear to shrink. Roots always take when tended, he answered. The wind moved through the prairie in long, steady waves, bending grass, but not breaking it. In town, men might still measure his choices. They might still watch his gait. But here, on ground turned by his own hands, something quieter was growing. Not just beans, not just feed. A statement that did not need to be shouted. And as the sun dipped low once more, Elias Turner understood that the strongest stand was sometimes made in soil, not in speech. In patience, not in pride. In the steady act of planting when others expected retreat. The first green shoots appeared on a Sunday morning, thin as threads and just as fragile. Elias saw them before he said anything, standing at the edge of the western rows with his hat in his hands, the early light turning the damp soil into bronze. For a long moment he did not move. He simply watched. Small arcs of life pushing through ground that had been called useless. Lila stepped beside him without a word. She crouched and touched the earth lightly, careful not to bend the tender stems. They took root, she said softly. Elias nodded once. He had known they might. But knowing and seeing were different things. Seeing made it real. By mid-morning, word had traveled. It always did. A lone rider passed along the distant road and slowed just enough to study the new rows cutting across Turner land. Later, another wagon rolled by. No one stopped. No one called out. But eyes measured the field the way they once measured his silence. The cattle grazed steady beyond the fence, their weight holding, their pace calm. The grain sacks in the barn would stretch now, not because town had relented, but because the soil had answered. That afternoon, Elias hitched the wagon and loaded 2 small crates. Not beans, not yet. Just extra milk and a few fresh eggs. Lila watched him secure the reins. You are going to town, she said. It was not a question. Yes, he replied. Not to ask. The ride felt different this time. Not defensive, not cautious, just steady. When he rolled down Main Street, heads turned as they had before. But there was something new in their gaze. Not approval, not resentment. Curiosity. He stopped near the general store and climbed down. Mr. Dobbins stepped out onto the boardwalk, arms folded. Elias handed him 1 crate. For the widows on Cedar Street, he said evenly. No charge. Dobbins blinked once, surprised. Why? Elias looked back toward the road leading to his ranch, toward land that now held more than cattle. Because it is good to feed what is near you, he answered. No speech followed. No defense offered. He climbed back onto the wagon and turned for home without waiting for thanks. When he returned, the sun was lowering behind the western ridge, light catching the small green rows like threads stitched into earth. Lila stood by the porch, the wooden sign above her shoulder faded but firm. Established with trust. Elias stepped down and handed her the empty crate. Town will talk, he said. She met his eyes, calm and unshaken. Let them talk about what you give, not what you refuse, she replied. The wind moved across the prairie in long, even breaths, bending the young plants, but not breaking them. Elias walked to the edge of the field one more time before night settled in. He crouched, resting his hand against the soil that had once seemed barren. The shoots trembled slightly in the breeze, but they held. And in that quiet stretch of land beneath a wide, honest sky, Elias Turner understood something that could not be undone. When you plant with purpose and stand without anger, even those who watch from a distance must eventually choose what they are seeing. Not defiance, not surrender, but growth. Autumn arrived without announcement, the way it always did on the prairie. First in the angle of the light, then in the way the wind carried a sharper edge. The bean rows that had once been thin green threads now stood waist-high, leaves broad and steady, pods hanging quiet and full beneath them. Elias walked the western field at sunrise, boots brushing against growth that had taken hold where doubt once stood. He ran his hand along a row, not to check, but to remember. Lila followed a few steps behind, a woven basket resting against her hip. They began the harvest slowly, snapping pods with patient hands, placing them carefully into the basket as if each one carried more than food. Across the fence line, the cattle grazed with healthy weight, their hides catching the pale gold light of morning. The grain in the barn had lasted. The fence had held. The soil had answered. By midday, a wagon approached from town again, but this time it did not stop at the road. It turned toward the gate. Elias watched from the porch, the old wooden sign above him weathered but firm. Established with trust. The wagon rolled in without haste. Mr. Dobbins climbed down first, hat in hand, eyes not as guarded as before. Behind him stood two widows from Cedar Street, shawls drawn tight against the breeze. They did not look past Lila. They looked at her. "We came to say thank you," one of them said softly. "The milk helped. The eggs, too." Elias nodded once. "There will be beans soon," he replied. No pride in his voice. No triumph. Just fact. Mr. Dobbins cleared his throat. "Town has been reconsidering," he said carefully. "Winter contracts for beef are open again." The words hung there. Not an apology, not an admission. Just a shift. Elias did not answer immediately. He stepped down from the porch and walked to the western field. He picked one full pod and turned it in his hand before bringing it back. He placed it into the widow's basket without ceremony. "We all grow better when we stop measuring each other," he said quietly. Lila stood beside him, steady as the fence line behind her. The wind moved through the rows, rustling leaves in a low, even whisper. No crowd gathered. No spectacle unfolded. Just a handful of people standing inside a gate that had once been tested and found unbroken. As the wagon turned to leave, the prairie stretched wide and honest beneath the open sky. Elias looked at the field one last time before the sun began its descent. The beans would carry them through winter. The cattle would sell. The sign on the porch would weather further, paint fading but meaning intact. He stepped back inside the house and set two plates on the table without thinking. Lila placed a bowl of freshly cooked beans between them, steam rising steady and simple. They sat down in the quiet that no longer felt empty. Outside, the fence line ran straight for half a mile, unloosened, unchallenged. And in that quiet stretch of Texas land, Elias Turner understood that trust was not proven by who stands with you in good weather, but by who remains when the wind tests the wire. Out here, justice did not need shouting. It needed planting, tending, and the courage to leave the gate open when respect finally arrived.